There are over 31,000 verses in the Bible. And out of those 31,000 Bible verses, 5 of them made me Catholic. Yes, 5 Bible verses prompted and led me to convert to the Catholic Church. Praise be to God.
Aku percaya akan Roh Kudus, Gereja Kristus yang kudus, persekutuan para kudus, pengampunan dosa, kebangkitan badan, kehidupan yang kekal.
Pertama-tama saya mau buat disclaimer kepada semua audiens, bahwa video ini ditujukan kepada para pengikut Kristus di dalam Gereja Katolik dan kepada siapa saja yang ingin mempelajari iman Katolik dengan tulus dan jujur. Tujuannya adalah katekese untuk memperkuat iman kepada Yesus Kristus dan memberikan tambahan pengetahuan tentang ajaran Kristiani di dalam gereja yang satu, kudus, Katolik, dan Apostolik, yang bersumber pada 3 pilar kebenaran yaitu Alkitab, tradisi suci gereja, dan magisterium gereja. Selain itu, video ini bersifat apologetik. Artinya, konten video ini berisi argumentasi-argumentasi yang mempertanggungjawabkan kebenaran ajaran iman Katolik. Jika Anda bukan beragama Katolik, saya tidak menyarankan Anda untuk lanjut menonton karena ajaran iman yang dijelaskan mungkin berbeda dan tidak sesuai dengan ajaran iman di dalam agama Anda. Namun jika Anda tetap ingin lanjut menonton, itu adalah hak Anda masing-masing sebagai pribadi yang memiliki kehendak bebas dan saya tidak bisa melarangnya. Jika Anda tidak setuju dengan ajaran iman Katolik yang dijelaskan di dalam video ini, tidak apa-apa. Toh, ini bukan ajaran agama Anda. Sekarang mari kita simak videonya. Salve. Erik adalah seorang Protestan Lutheran yang menjadi Katolik. 25 tahun hidupnya dihabiskan untuk menjalankan ajaran Protestan sebagai seorang Lutheran. Tapi justru yang mendorong dan menuntunnya kepada iman Katolik adalah membaca Alkitab saja. Dengan kata lain, doktrin dan praktik Protestan Sola Skriptura-lah yang membuatnya menjadi seorang Katolik. Bukan pasangan, bukan teman, bukan pendeta, bukan orang tua, atau siapapun yang menuntunnya ke Katolik. Keinginan dan misinya adalah untuk mendorong orang Kristen non-Katolik untuk mendengarkan dan membaca Alkitab saja tanpa prasangka dan indoktrinasi. Jika dilakukan dengan rendah hati dan jujur, ia sangat yakin bahwa hal itu akan mendorong orang Kristen non-Katolik untuk mengakui bahwa Alkitab adalah buku Katolik yang disusun oleh Gereja Katolik, dan bahwa Gereja Katolik memuat kepenuhan kebenaran dan Wahyu Kristen. 5 ayat Alkitab yang menuntunnya ke Gereja Katolik. Alkitab berisi lebih dari 31.000 ayat, yang masing-masing menawarkan kebijaksanaan dan kebenaran yang mendalam. Namun, ada 5 ayat tertentu yang mendorong perjalanannya ke Katolik. Ayat-ayat ini tidak hanya menantang keyakinan Protestannya, ayat-ayat itu justru menerangi jalan yang akhirnya membawanya pulang ke Gereja Katolik. Dia membagikan 5 ayat yang mengubahnya, bagaimana ayat-ayat itu membentuk pemahamannya, dan mengapa ayat-ayat itu terus menopang imannya. Inilah kelima ayat Alkitab tersebut. 1. Yakobus 2 ayat 24, Iman dan Perbuatan. Kamu lihat, bahwa manusia dibenarkan karena perbuatan-perbuatannya dan bukan hanya karena iman. Ayat ini selalu menjadi teka-teki selama tahun-tahunnya sebagai seorang Lutheran. Landasan teologi Protestan, khususnya dalam Lutheranisme, adalah sola fide, pembenaran hanya oleh iman. Namun, Yakobus 2 ayat 24 secara langsung menantang ajaran ini. Di sekolah menengah, ia bertanya kepada guru agamanya bagaimana kita dapat menyelaraskan ayat ini dengan keyakinan kita. Jawabannya, Yakobus berbicara kepada orang percaya yang telah dibenarkan. Sebagai seorang remaja yang naif, ia menerima jawaban itu tanpa bertanya. Bertahun-tahun kemudian, ia mendesak pendeta Lutherannya tentang ayat yang sama. Jawabannya, itu adalah teka-teki. Penjelasan yang diterimanya hanya memperdalam rasa frustrasinya. Jika iman saja yang membenarkan, bagaimana mungkin iman tidak bisa berdiri sendiri? Di mana kitab suci secara eksplisit mengajarkan bahwa iman tidak pernah sendirian? Tidak. Sebaliknya, Yakobus sangat jelas, iman tanpa perbuatan adalah mati. Titik. Ayat ini adalah retakan pertama dalam fondasi pandangan dunia Protestan Erik. 2 Matius 7 ayat 21-23 melakukan kehendak Bapa. Bukan setiap orang yang berseru kepadaku, Tuhan, Tuhan, akan masuk ke dalam kerajaan sorga, melainkan dia yang melakukan kehendak Bapa-Ku yang di sorga. Ayat ini merupakan salah satu peringatan yang paling serius dalam Alkitab. Ayat ini menggambarkan orang-orang percaya yang melakukan pekerjaan-pekerjaan besar dalam nama Yesus, bernubuat, mengusir setan, dan melakukan mukjizat, tetapi ditolak pada hari penghakiman karena mereka gagal melakukan kehendak Bapa. Teologi Protestan sering mengajarkan bahwa perbuatan baik merupakan hasil sampingan daripada iman. Tetapi ayat-ayat ini menekankan bahwa melakukan kehendak Tuhan sangat penting untuk keselamatan. Iman saja tidak cukup. Yesus secara eksplisit menyatakan bahwa kasih kepada Tuhan dan sesama, inti dari kehendak Bapa, adalah yang menuntun kepada kehidupan kekal. Ayat ini menyentuh inti dari sistem kepercayaan Lutheran, menantang gagasan Martin Luther bahwa pembenaran tidak terkait dengan tindakan kita. 3 Matius 16 ayat 16-19, batu karang dan kunci kerajaan surga. Engkau adalah Petrus, dan di atas batu karang ini aku akan mendirikan jemaatku, dan alam maut tidak akan menguasainya. Kepadamu akan kuberikan kunci kerajaan surga. Arti penting ayat ini tidak dapat dilebih-lebihkan. Di dalamnya, Yesus mengubah nama Simon menjadi Petrus, yang berarti batu karang, dan menyatakannya sebagai fondasi gerejanya. Sebagai seorang Lutheran, Erik diajarkan bahwa batu karang merujuk pada pengakuan iman Petrus, bukan Petrus sendiri. Pendetanya bahkan menunjukkan perbedaan antara kata Yunani Petros atau Petrus dan Petra atau batu karang. Namun, argumen tersebut tidak berlaku jika diteliti lebih lanjut. Perbedaan antara Petros dan Petra hanya ada karena bahasa Yunani mengharuskan akhiran yang berjenis kelamin. Dalam bahasa Aram yang Yesus gunakan, kata untuk batu karang adalah kefas, sama untuk kedua contoh tersebut. Selain itu, Yesus memberkati Petrus dan menunjuknya dengan otoritas yang diberikan. Kepadamu akan kuberikan kunci kerajaan sorga. Ini bukan sesuatu yang simbolis atau metaforis. Ini adalah penunjukan kepemimpinan secara langsung. Ayat-ayat ini memaksanya untuk menghadapi otoritas Gereja Katolik, dengan garis suksesi apostoliknya yang tidak terputus yang dapat ditelusuri kembali ke Petrus. 4. Filipi 2 ayat 12-13, kerjakan keselamatanmu. Kerjakanlah keselamatanmu dengan takut dan gentar, karena Allah lah yang mengerjakan di dalam kamu baik kemauan maupun pekerjaan menurut kerelaannya. Ayat ini mungkin yang paling menantang bagi kepercayaan Protestannya. Teologi Lutheran menolak gagasan mengerjakan keselamatan, sebaliknya menekankan bahwa keselamatan sepenuhnya merupakan perbuatan Allah, terlepas dari usaha manusia. Namun di sini, Paulus secara eksplisit memanggil orang percaya untuk bekerja sama dengan kasih karunia Allah. Ayat-ayat tersebut tidak menyangkal kedaulatan Allah, tetapi meneguhkannya. Namun, ayat-ayat tersebut juga mengungkapkan bahwa keselamatan melibatkan kasih karunia ilahi dan partisipasi manusia. Ini adalah dasar Alkitabiah yang jelas bagi ajaran Katolik tentang kerja sama kasih karunia dan kehendak bebas, konsep yang ditolak keras oleh kaum Lutheran. 1 Korintus 1 ayat 10-13, kesatuan dalam Kristus. Demi nama Tuhan kita Yesus Kristus, aku menasihati kamu, saudara-saudara, supaya kamu semua seyes kata dan jangan ada perpecahan di antara kamu. Ayat ini sangat pribadi bagi Erik. Selama kebaktian Prapaskah, pendetanya berkhotbah tentang ayat-ayat ini, dan dia mengalami apa yang hanya bisa dia gambarkan sebagai momen rahmat. Saat dia merenungkan ayat itu, dia dikejutkan oleh perpecahan yang mencolok dalam Protestanisme. Reformasi memecah belah kekristenan menjadi sekte dan denominasi yang tak terhitung jumlahnya. Masing-masing mengaku mengikuti Kristus, diterangi oleh Roh Kudus tetapi terbagi-bagi oleh puluhan ribu doktrin. Membaca ayat-ayat ini, dia membayangkan mengganti kata-kata Paulus dengan nama-nama reformis. Saya mengikuti Luther, saya mengikuti Calvin, saya mengikuti Zwingli. Bukankah ini perpecahan yang diperingatkan Paulus? Sebaliknya, Gereja Katolik tetap bersatu dalam doktrin dan praktik iman selama lebih dari 2000 tahun. Kesimpulan yang Erik buat adalah kelima ayat ini bukan sekadar ayat. Itu adalah undangan untuk mencari kebenaran. Kelima ayat ini menuntunnya untuk bertanya, meneliti, dan berdoa. Akhirnya, kelima ayat ini menuntunnya ke Gereja Katolik, tempat ia menemukan kepenuhan iman, yang berakar pada kitab suci, tradisi, dan otoritas pengajaran gereja. Jika Anda pernah bergumul dengan ayat-ayat ini, ia mengundang Anda semua untuk menjelajahinya dengan hati terbuka. Baginya, ia selamanya bersyukur atas perjalanan yang diilhami oleh ayat-ayat ini. Sekarang mari kita dengarkan kesaksian lengkapnya.
There are over 31,000 verses in the Bible. 5 Bible verses prompted and led me to convert to the Catholic Church. But why these 5 instead of those 5 or those 10 or 20? The Catholics put that passage there for a reason. If it wasn't for this verse, I wouldn't be here. There are over 31,000 verses in the Bible. And out of those 31,000 Bible verses, 5 of them made me Catholic. Yes, 5 Bible verses prompted and led me to convert to the Catholic Church. Praise be to God. Yes, I am so thankful. But what are these 5 verses? And how did it happen? Okay, so we're going to be exploring these 5 verses and see why they converted me in the way that they converted me and how they kept me Catholic. But why these 5 instead of those 5 or those 10 or 20? Because reading those 31,000 verses, it was these 5 that put the nail in the coffin. Okay, so I'm not going to leave you in suspense. We're going to get started right away here. And number 5, very famous, comes from James 2:24. Quote, "You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone," end quote. I'm going to be straight up honest with you. I'm a convert from Protestantism, namely Lutheranism. This verse was a problem, not just for Lutheran, but for Lutherans in general to this day. I never ever got a good explanation for this verse, or this chapter rather. And it goes all the way back to high school. I'm 41 years old. I remember asking my religion teacher, how can we believe in faith alone and not by works when James says, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone? And he with alacrity said, well, St. James is talking to believers that have already been justified. And, you know, as a 16-year-old kid, I naively just took his word for it. You know, I didn't question him. He's a teacher in authority. I'm not going to push his buttons. You don't do that. Move on about, 15 years. I asked my Lutheran pastor, what is up with James 2:24? What's going on here? I asked him twice. First time he said, it's an enigma, right? Basically, we can't understand it. It's like a contradiction, but it's not a contradiction, and we just take it at face value. The second time I asked him, he quoted what he thought was Martin Luther. And this is what he had to say about James 2:24. It is therefore faith alone which justifies, and yet the faith which justifies is not alone. That actually comes from John Calvin, not Martin Luther, even though most Lutherans quote that and think it comes from Luther. Nonetheless, that's what a lot of Lutherans use when I dialogue with them when talking about James 2, especially this verse, right? Let me just read it, say it again. It is faith alone which justifies, and yet the faith which justifies is not alone. This is what Martin Luther had to say. We say that justification is effective without works, and not that faith is without works. Basically, faith alone justifies, faith is never alone. Okay. That didn't sit well with me. I really don't know how people can say this because A, it's a contradiction. Okay. If faith alone justifies, and then you say faith is not alone, then how is faith alone? You know what I'm saying? That's a contradiction. Now, if you want to qualify faith alone and say that it's like faith working through love, fine. Here's the main problem I have with this saying, which many Lutherans use. Faith is never alone. Or the faith which justifies is not alone. Or the faith is without work, is not without works. Where is that in the Bible? Where does it say in all 31,000 plus verses that faith is never alone, or that faith is never without works? It never says that. In fact, it says the exact opposite. Christ warns us that if our faith doesn't produce fruit, we will be cut off. James 2, his whole point in James 2 is, if you have faith but not works, what profit is that? Well, if your faith always produces works, why is he even mentioning faith without works? Do you see the contradiction there and how it doesn't make sense? Anyways, this verse always was problematic for me as a Lutheran. No matter what any teacher or pastor or friend said, it always was a problem with me. I remember having thoughts and imaginations of getting really mad at my pastor or some parishioners or whatever, and going to my church and spray painting this verse all over the church building. Just, you know, like, ha, take that. Number 5, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Again, now I'm a Catholic, and when I talk to Protestants about this verse, you will get all these different kinds of contexts, different hermeneutics, you know, equivocations, and again, I'm not trying to patronize, and that's fine. Well, it's not fine, but you know what? It doesn't matter, because what you see here, forget works in James 2. It says you see that a person is justified not by faith alone. That's all you need. I mean, that verse should convert everybody, right? Okay, number 5. Number 4 comes from Matthew 7, 21, verse 23. I guess this is a passage rather than a verse, but nonetheless. Quote, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do mighty works in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" End quote. Okay, so this is obviously referring to the last day or judgment day, the eschaton. And what's interesting in this passage is the stark focus on doing the will of the Father, doing mighty works, and how one really enters into eternal rest with Jesus Christ. Okay? So, notice in this passage, Jesus says, "Lord, Lord," twice. So, not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord." Well, I've had a lot of Protestants say, well, these people in this passage, they don't have faith, they're not true believers. I'm sorry, but if you're saying Lord twice, you have faith. No one can say that Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit. And if you have the double Lord, you really have faith. And notice here, you do many mighty works. So you have faith, Lord, Lord, and you're doing many mighty works, and not just many mighty works, but in the name of Jesus. Why is Jesus saying, "Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness"? Because they didn't do the will of the Father. But the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven, that's the one who will enter the kingdom of heaven. What's the will of the Father? To love God and to love neighbor. That's what it means. So you can have all the faith to move mountains. You can talk in tongues and do all these works and drive out demons, but if you don't have love, you're nothing. Jesus is going to say to you, depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Another thing that Protestants bring up says, I never knew you. Jesus says, I never knew you. And these are people with faith that did mighty works in his name. You got to know something about what it means to know in the Bible. Like when Adam knew Eve, okay? The meaning is an intimate and even conjugal knowing, right? You know someone so well, like a spouse knows his or her spouse. Well, he never knew these people in that sense. I mean, of course he knows them. He created them. He knows every single movement of theirs, what they do and what they don't do, where they stand and where they sit. Of course he knows those. But he never knew him in that intimate sense where they're doing the will of the Father, loving God and loving neighbor. Now, how does this help convert me to Catholicism? Well, in Protestantism or Lutheranism, we believe in justification by faith alone, and that good works and doing the will of the Father have nothing to do with justification or your ultimate salvation. Now, they'll say that it's important to do good works and to do the will of the Father, but they're like these byproducts, right? That just naturally flow from faith, a true faith. That's what I was taught. And I believed it, because usually when people teach you and they have that sense of authority and you really don't research it on your own, you're going to stay stuck, right? Until I started to read the Bible, all 31,000 verses of it. And I would come across passages like this, and it's just not a Protestant verse. Not that there are really any Protestant verses, okay? The Catholics put that passage there for a reason, because it manifests the life of a devout Catholic who enters into the abode of the Father in eternal rest. Okay, number 4, Matthew 7:21, verse 23. Number 3, Matthew 16, verses 16 through 19, quote, Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven, end quote. Notice I put a little emphasis on the word you. Because what is this? Okay, I said 5 verses. I should have said passages, because this is 3 verses. Okay. Let me go back to before I converted to Catholicism. So I'm a Lutheran, I'm in my journey, I'm reading my Bible, I'm coming across these passages and these verses that don't sit well with me. They don't sound very Protestant, okay? And so I go in a dialogue for like a year with my pastor, my Lutheran pastor. And we're dialoguing back and forth via email. And I mean, we're going at it. Sometimes it's charitable and cordial, sometimes it's seemingly polemical or, you know, a little harsh. You know, he's defending his faith. He doesn't want to lose me. And I'm on my journey to discovering the truth of Catholicism, even though I'm not there yet. So the whole issue of this passage for him, or for me, I guess you could say, was who is the rock, or what is the rock? There's so much emphasis put on the rock. And he brought up the Greek. On this Petros, I will build my church. Or you are Petros, and on this Petra, I will build my church. And he claimed that they're not the same Greek words. So therefore, the rock isn't Peter if they're not the same Greek words. This is confusing to so many people, Protestant, Catholic alike. It's not confusing. Petra and Petros mean the same thing. They're rock. It means rock. It means rock. Just like dog and puppy, right? It means the same thing. Okay? The problem is that the word rock, Petra, right, is feminine. So if Christ were to use on this Petra, I will build my church, right? You are Petra, and on this Petra, it'd be like translated into the English as you are Rocket or you are Patricia. That's how it would translate. But remember, he changed his name to Kepha, Peter. And not only that, in the Aramaic, because remember, Jesus is speaking Galilean Aramaic to Peter and his disciples, the word for rock is Kepha. That's it. There is no feminine, Greek gets all weird. There is no feminine properties to the words. It's just, you are Kepha, and on this Kepha I will build my church. And my Lutheran pastor retorted, well, we don't have the Aramaic in the Bible. We have the Koine Greek. And I'm just like, that's not a valid retort or defense or argument against me. Nonetheless, I meditated over this verse, and I noticed, if you realize the context of what is going on here, there's no way that rock could mean anything else than Peter. Because notice that Jesus blessed him. Okay, how many times does Jesus bless someone in the New Testament? Or how many times does someone get blessed in the New Testament? Mary was blessed, right? Blessed are you among women. Peter was blessed. Blessing is a huge thing. You cannot just say, oh, blessed are you, Simon Jonah. Like that doesn't mean anything. A blessing is a special signification, right? Of which plays into why he changed his name as well. Like the role that Peter is given, the office that Peter is given. And when he says, I tell you, remember, I emphasized the word you how many times? I tell you, you are Peter. I will give you the keys to the kingdom, whatever you bind on earth. Remember, this is all in the singular. This isn't plural. All his apostles are in, around the campfire, wherever there are. And he's calling and singling out Peter and saying all this stuff. So on this rock, which his name means, what else would that refer to? Right? So let's say the rock is Christ. A lot of people say, oh, the rock is Christ. Well, are you giving the keys to Christ? Is Christ giving the keys to himself? Is Christ saying whatever Christ binds? You know what I mean? Is Christ blessing him? No, it's all Peter. Peter, 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 all throughout this passage. There's no way you can get around it. It's Peter. Okay? And a lot of people will say, well, the rock's his confession. Okay, the Catechism says this. Catechism of the Catholic Church. Okay, I'm not going to... the solid rock foundation of his confession. Whatever. It's Peter. Did Christ give Peter's confession the keys? Did Christ rename the confession to Peter? No, it's all Peter. So if you want to say it's confession, I don't necessarily have a problem with it, but it's Peter. Okay. So this helped me convert to Catholicism in versus like say Eastern Orthodoxy or some other branch of Protestantism. Because what makes Catholicism, or the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church? It's the Pope, the universal magisterium. Nobody else has that. Okay. Number 3, Matthew 16, verses 16 through 19. Gosh, what are number 2 and 1, guys? So number 2, Philippians 2, verses 2, verse 13. I'm sorry, chapter 2, 12, verses 13. Quote, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and work for his good pleasure, end quote. I'm not going to lie, this is the one single the one single passage that I've never, ever gotten a good explanation from a Protestant. Never. I never have. And it's interesting because there are a couple elements in here that help me, because in Lutheranism, one, we don't believe in working out your own salvation. That is like anathema on Lutheran theology or doctrine. Okay? It just is. I mean, Lutherans really don't believe in free will. Okay, they believe in the bondage of the will. So basically, you're on one of two horses, God or the devil. And it's God riding you or the devil riding you, and you're just along for the ride. That's Luther's bondage of the will, right? So God saves you without your consent or free will. That's what Lutherans teach, okay? Among Calvinists and other Protestants. But so free will is just, it's out of the question, along with working out your salvation, along with cooperation of grace. I don't know about every Protestant, but Lutherans vehemently deny cooperation of grace, because that goes along with free will and consent and choosing. And Luther's like, well, that goes against the sovereignty of God and his grace and all that stuff. Well, this passage, work out your own salvation, boy, that's a tough one for Protestants. I want a Protestant to give me a good defense apologetic argument for that, or some sort of hermeneutic, because I have yet to hear it. Now, initially, we don't merit grace. Initially, we don't become a Christian by our own merits or works or strength or the law, okay? But once we become a Christian by grace through faith and not by works, right? Now we have Christ living in us, and now we have the grace to do what? Work out our own salvation. And notice it says salvation, okay? Notice in a lot of Paul's epistles, when he's talking about being saved, he says saved. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure, no, he does use salvation. Remember when he says in Romans, I forget the chapter, our salvation is nearer now than it was before. So when he's talking about salvation, it's always in the future. It's that final salvation. It's, entering into heaven. Final salvation. And that's what we're working out right now. We've already been saved in the past, and that's why he says, for by grace you have been saved in the past. That's when we become a Christian. But once you become a Christian, you have to work out your own salvation. But you do that with grace. That's why he says with fear and trembling. Because St. Augustine says, if you don't have fear and trembling, you would think you're doing it yourself on your own merits. No, we do it with grace. Next verse. For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Cooperation of grace, free will, it's all right there. It's right there. God's working in me against my will? No. There is no freedom of love if God is compelling me against my will. And then I can will and work out for his good pleasure, but it's him working through me. You know what I mean? So this verse definitely helped convert me to Catholicism. Number one. This might seem obscure. This might kind of surprise you. Be like, huh? Out of all the verses that converted you to Catholicism. Well, there's a little story behind it. So, number one, 1 Corinthians 1, verses 10 through 13, quote, I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there is quarreling among you, my brothers. What I mean is that each one of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Kepha, or I follow Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? End quote. You want to know where it all began? It was a Lenten service. So Lutherans, they have Lenten services. They don't call them Mass. And I remember it being dark. And this was what the pastor preached on. And I had an epiphany. I did. I had a grace. Some might say, well, you're just superstitious or it's just a coincidence. But hey, I'm Catholic now, and if it wasn't for this verse, I wouldn't be here. So, why this verse? For some reason, when this verse was said aloud by my pastor, I had this, I don't want to call it a vision or a locution or anything like that. I'm not claiming that. But something I saw, and I saw the history of the church and the Reformation and all the division within Protestantism, and then I just implanted the names of the reformers into that last verse. So for instance, I follow Luther, or I follow Calvin, or I follow Zwingli, or I follow Knox. You know what I'm saying? Was Luther crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Calvin? Again, I know Protestants would scoff at my, interpretation of this passage. But he's talking about divisions and how some people are following this person and some people are following that person and so on and so forth, and they're not united in following and being one. Because Christ isn't divided, yet they're divided following individual persons. Well, what is Protestantism? Is not Protestantism, again, no offense to my Protestant brothers and sisters, is not Protestantism stark division of individual ecclesial communions following individual people? Is Christ not divided? You cannot say that about the Catholic Church. You can't. I don't care how many scandals you bring up or how many individual Catholics do this or don't believe that, or a cardinal says this or a bishop does that. It doesn't matter. We've always been united on doctrine, dogma, practice, discipline, right? Universal magisterium. It doesn't matter if 90% fell away. We're still united. It doesn't matter. Okay. But yeah, this is what did it. This is what sparked and provoked me into researching everything Catholicism. Because I knew that I belonged to an ecclesial communion that traced its lineage back to Martin Luther in the 16th century. And what happened before that? I needed to find out. Not from my pastor. He's going to tell me his version of it to keep me Lutheran. My parents? No way. Nobody. Friends? I had to do the research myself, meditate, pray, and it led me to the Catholic Church. So those are my 5 verses, passages if you want to call them. Those are the 5 verses, the top 5 verses that prompted, led me, and converted me to Catholicism.
Aku percaya akan Roh Kudus, Gereja Kristus yang kudus.